They said roads decide wars, not the roads on maps, the roads inside men, the shortcuts they take, the turns they fear, the turns they don't see. Sometimes history follows a path no general planned, because one driver took a road that wasn't his to take. December 1944, the Ardennes, snow that swallowed boots, forests that swallowed sound, engines that steamed like animals exhaling into a white world. They called it the Battle of the Bulge, the last great lunge of a wounded empire pressing west while winter pressed down on everyone. It wasn't just a battle of men and steel. It was a battle of gasoline. In winter, armies move not on courage, but on fuel. No fuel, no tanks, no tanks, no lines, no hope. Convoys wound through the pines like slow arteries, carrying drums and jerrycans, the blood that kept the body of an army alive. Those trucks did not look like victory. They looked like necessity on wheels. One of them belonged to a driver named Miller. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe his name was something else. The records don't remember, and that's the point. He wasn't meant to be remembered. He was meant to deliver, a single cell in a giant organism, a driver among drivers on a road among roads. He had orders. He had a map. He had a route that kept him away from artillery and toward depots. A path dug into doctrine by men who rarely saw trees this close. But the forest didn't care for doctrine. Snow fell sideways. Signs vanished under ice. The compass quivered like a tired hand. Somewhere between a command post that promised certainty and a crossroads that promised trouble, the truck drifted 3 degrees off obedience. The tires slipped, the rear fish-tailed, and the world turned by one wrong decision's worth of degrees. He took the wrong road. He cursed. He checked the compass. He looked for landmarks that weren't there. He pressed on because stopping in winter is a decision you make for death. He pressed on because trucks need momentum like men need faith. The road narrowed, then opened into a long, empty corridor of black pines. Branches arched overhead like ribs of an iron lung. The snow hissed under tire chains. The engine hummed, steady but anxious, a prayer with pistons. He followed it, hoping the road would forgive him. Behind the tree line, beyond the reach of the truck's lamps, an American armored unit waited, listening to the sound of their own engines dying. They had ammunition. They had orders to hold. They did not have fuel. Tanks settled into snow like sleeping whales. Crewmen breathed into cupped hands and debated hope like it was rations. A war can end the moment a tank cannot start. They radioed. They begged. They calculated. Fuel trucks were coming on paper. But paper doesn't fight a winter war. Men do. Men and the stupid luck that follows them when all clever plans have been used up. The wrong road bent left around a frozen stream, rose into a narrow ridge, and then, like a hand pointing, aimed straight at the dying unit. Miller didn't know the unit existed. The unit didn't know Miller existed. But the road knew both. He saw shapes first. Hulks slumped under snow. Then figures, men, moving with the slow economy of exhaustion. Guns rimmed with frost. Faces with eyes too tired to widen. He eased off the throttle, not by order, by instinct, the driver's reflex that says someone could be broken here. A young lieutenant ran toward the cab, 25 in the file, 50 in the cold. He didn't salute. He didn't ask permission. He climbed the running board and shouted through glass. One word that mattered more than rank or plan, fuel. Miller nodded. He didn't say how much. He didn't say where he was supposed to go. He didn't mention the convoy he'd drifted away from when the road made a liar out of the map. He killed the engine and stepped down into air that stole breath like a thief. Start that one, the lieutenant said, pointing at a Sherman sitting proud and useless, a statue of intent. Then the others. They dragged stiff hose across the snow. They cracked drums that had frozen into the shape of their purpose. Metal screamed softly, cold against cold. Fuel poured like a promise. The first tank coughed, as if remembering how to live. The second leaned forward, listening. The third did not believe in miracles and stayed asleep. More, said the lieutenant, voice flat with the cruelty of necessity. More, said the tank, with the appetite of a god. Miller glanced at gauges. Math made of needles. Not enough. Not for everyone. But one tank moving is worth 10 tanks waiting. He filled the first. He fed the second. He trickled a few precious liters into the third, the price of a chance. He did not fuel his fear. Engines woke like beasts roused by fire. A low growl that grew into a chorus. Sound moves differently in snow. It bends, it holds. It becomes something you can lean on. Crewmen climbed in. They did not cheer. They shifted into gear, because movement is how soldiers say thank you when lungs are busy with cold. The lieutenant turned back to Miller. "What's your unit?" Miller hesitated, not because he didn't know, but because knowing suddenly felt irrelevant. "Fuel," he said. "My unit is fuel." The lieutenant nodded, as if that were rank enough. They formed up 3 tanks and a truck. Not a column, a thread. A thread trying to sew shut a rip in the line before the enemy found it, and ripped it wider. The road ahead was a throat. They drove into it. You don't chase tanks in a fuel truck if you want to live long. But Miller wasn't thinking about long. He was thinking about next, the next curve, the next hill, the next place where a tank would need to drink. The lieutenant watched his map disintegrate into guesses. "Up there," he said, pointing into white that could hide anything. They reached a crossroads that wasn't on the map. It didn't matter. War doesn't happen on maps. War happens where you run out of choices. 2 German half-tracks and an armored car slid from the trees. Neat danger, the kind that wins wars on paper. The first Sherman fired. The sound was a door slammed in God's house. The armored car unfolded into a brief, ugly flower of fire. The half-tracks pivoted professionally, then died professionally under the second shot. The crossroads, this unmarked, unimportant place, belonged to those who still had fuel. They secured it without ceremony. The lieutenant checked gauges like a priest checks candles. "More," he said. "Quieter now. If we move, we hold the ridge." Miller broke the seals on 2 drums meant for another unit. He knew the rule. He knew the punishment. He also knew what a tank without gasoline becomes a tomb. They moved. Word travels in war along strange pathways, rumor, wind, fear. Somewhere, an American battalion heard armor was moving again. Somewhere, a German forward element heard the same thing and chose a different road. On a staff map far away, red and blue arrows slowed their drift toward catastrophe. The ridge wasn't high, just high enough to see a little farther than the trees wanted you to. They reached it as the light died and the cold grew teeth. Men tightened straps and promises. Miller parked the truck where luck might not notice it. He listened to tanks idle like hearts learning a new beat. Night pressed down. Snow thickened. And out of that thickness, the first Panthers appeared. Sleek, patient, confident, the dark beauty of machines built to believe in themselves. The Shermans were not beautiful. They were stubborn, not designed to impress, designed to persist. Fuel had given them position. Position might give them a chance. The ritual began. Shells traded across a distance that punished mistakes. Trees shredded into wooden dust. Tracer stitched brief handwriting across black air. Somewhere a man called for a medic with a voice that would keep calling in dreams. Miller crouched by the truck, hands shaking inside gloves warmed by work. He watched needles dip like tired eyes. He rationed in heartbeats. When a tank reversed, coughing fumes, he fed it like an animal you hoped would remember your kindness. The battle stretched. The snow learned the taste of cordite. The ridge held for now on inches of ground and gallons of fuel, and the thin, stubborn line between not enough and just enough. And in the dark, with engines purring and shells hissing and men counting breaths between impacts, a thought rooted itself where fear had lived. This was not the right road. This was the road that arrived. The ridge was still holding, barely. The Shermans crouched like wounded animals, breathing black smoke, steel steaming in the night. The Panthers below waited in silence, their guns tracking the horizon, their commanders confident that the world would return to its predictable rhythm. But the world had changed. It had changed because a driver had taken the wrong road. Miller leaned against the truck's fender, breath clouding the air, the smell of fuel thick enough to taste. He could feel the battle through the soles of his boots, every detonation shuddering through the frozen ground. Each vibration was a reminder. Motion is survival. The lieutenant knelt beside a radio that barely worked, whispering into static. He wasn't asking for orders anymore. He was asking for time. But time, like fuel, was always running out. The night stretched into something endless. Miller's job in theory was simple: distribute fuel, conserve what remained, and pray the math balanced before dawn. But war had a way of making simple things impossible. He counted liters with numb fingers. He knew each drum was a heartbeat, each hose a vein. The battlefield had turned into anatomy, and he was its bloodstream. "Another tank needs 10 gallons, someone shouted. 10, Miller repeated. His voice dull. He gave 12. Numbers had lost their meaning. Only rhythm mattered now. Pump, pour, start, stop. The gauge needle wavered like an exhausted soldier trying to stand. Every drop that left the truck was a confession. I am giving you what keeps me alive. The second Sherman groaned to life again. The third sputtered, then found its breath. Engines hummed like a distant hymn to persistence. For a moment, even the snow seemed to listen. Tanks, Miller realized, had a kind of language. They spoke through vibration, through the rhythm of their engines, through the cough that preceded ignition. He had spent enough time near them to understand their grammar. When they were healthy, they sounded arrogant. When they were scared, they stuttered. And when they were dying, they whispered. That night, he listened as they argued with the cold. They wanted to move. They wanted purpose. It was strange. Machines, when deprived of motion, seemed to ache. Maybe that's why men love them, because they recognize themselves in that restlessness. Miller patted the hood of one tank as if soothing a horse. "Easy, girl," he muttered. The steel didn't answer, but the vibration under his hand steadied. For a brief moment, the line between man and machine disappeared. They were both just engines, burning what little they had left to stay warm. When dawn came, it didn't arrive gently. It cracked open the night like artillery. The light was pale, unearned, indifferent. It revealed everything the dark had been kind enough to hide. Burned trees, frozen bodies, twisted metal glinting under frost. And it revealed motion. On the slope below, the panthers were moving again. "They'll come for us," said the lieutenant. "They have to. He didn't say the rest. We don't have enough to run." The radio hissed, coughed, died. The cold had finally eaten the batteries. Miller exhaled through his scarf, the sound more a growl than a sigh. He checked the drums. 2 remained. Not enough to run, but maybe enough to fight. The lieutenant read his mind. "Give the last to the lead tank," he said. "We'll anchor here." "Anchor," Miller repeated, tasting the word. "Anchors are meant for ships that don't plan to move again." He didn't argue. He rolled the drum, opened the cap, watched the amber liquid shimmer like honey in the light. The smell of life, wrapped in danger. The driver's hand shook, not from fear, just fatigue, the kind that rewrites what fear means. The fuel hissed into the tank. The Sherman's engine coughed, then steadied into a rhythm that made the air vibrate. That sound, more than any speech, any command, told the men they still had a chance. When the Germans returned, they did so with precision. 2 panthers, supported by infantry, approached from the tree line. The plan was simple: encircle, flank, finish, but the panthers were cautious now. They had learned, perhaps, that even chaos could be disciplined. They fired in intervals, methodical, practiced. The ridge replied with anger and exhaustion. Shells collided mid-air, scattering metal rain. Trees fell like dying witnesses. The second Sherman took a hit. Its turret jammed, smoke curling from its hatches. Men bailed out, crawling through snow that hissed as it met their heat. Miller didn't look away. He had seen enough of war to know that looking away was a privilege. He moved toward the wreck with a hose dragging behind him. Fuel sloshed in the line like a heartbeat. The lieutenant grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" "Keeping the others alive," Miller said simply. He refueled the remaining tanks under fire, standing between the living and the dying. Shells landed close enough to make the truck rock. Every vibration was a reminder that logic and luck were the same thing, just measured in seconds. The lieutenant found him there, staring at nothing. "You look like you lost something," he said. Miller nodded toward the horizon. Direction. The younger man laughed, tired and grateful for the sound. Join the club. He sat beside him, both of them watching the morning turn from gray to a lighter shade of gray. You saved us, said the lieutenant. I got lost, Miller replied. Same thing this time. They shared a silence that said everything words couldn't. Both knew that what had happened here wouldn't make the reports, not the driver, not the wrong turn, not the drums of fuel that had been meant for someone else. Wars weren't built to remember luck. They were built to remember names, and Miller didn't have one that mattered. In every war, luck travels by machinery. A tank that starts on the first try, a shell that misses by an inch, a driver who takes a wrong turn at the right moment. We call it coincidence, but that's just how progress hides its chaos. Somewhere behind them, supply lines were already recalculating. New orders, new shipments, new paperwork to erase the impossible geometry that had just saved a ridge. Logisticians would never see it as luck. They'd call it redistributed assets. But for those who had been here, who had seen what chance looked like when it caught fire, it was something holier. It was the logic of fuel. The principle that survival is not planned, only continued. When Miller looked back down the ridge, he saw his own tracks winding into the forest, 2 long scars through snow, the story written in tire marks. He wondered what would happen when the snow melted, when spring found this place and erased the evidence. Would anyone still know that one truck had changed a battle? Would anyone care? The lieutenant noticed his gaze. Hell of a road, huh? He said. Miller nodded. Wasn't mine to take. Maybe it was, the lieutenant said. You were the only one who did. Miller didn't answer. He didn't need to. Some truths don't sound right when spoken aloud. By midday, orders finally reached them, late, confused, contradictory. They were to hold the ridge, then abandon it. They were to regroup, then wait. They were to expect resupply that wouldn't come for 2 days. It was the same symphony of bureaucracy that had nearly killed them before. Perfect plans written by perfect hands that had never touched mud. The lieutenant folded the papers, tucked them into his coat, and looked toward Miller. You going to stay? He asked. Miller shrugged. Trucks dry. Then I guess you're staying. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The man who'd brought motion to a battlefield was now bound to stillness. He smiled faintly. About time, he said. That evening, the smell of fuel still lingered in the air. It mixed with smoke, cordite, and pouring pine, an ugly human perfume that meant the day was over. The tanks were quiet now. The men slept against them, their breaths steaming in rhythm with cooling engines. And Miller lay in the cab of his truck, watching snowflakes melt on the windshield. They left streaks like veins, like rivers, like roads. He followed them with his eyes until they disappeared, thinking of all the wrong roads in the world, and how many of them had carried history without anyone noticing. He thought of how progress, like war, depends not on plans, but on errors that work. Somewhere, far from the ridge, generals were already redrawing maps. They were drawing the new front lines, marking supply points, correcting logistical anomalies. No one would mark the road Miller had taken. No one would mark the small circle of forest where the wrong road had become the right one. But history doesn't live on paper. It lives in the fuel lines of the world, in the choices made by tired men at frozen crossroads. Because sometimes a mistake travels farther than any order ever could. The ridge held through another night. No reinforcements came. No orders changed. Only the cold deepened, a kind of silence that seeps into the bones and turns men into memories before they're gone. By dawn, the snow had crusted into a hard, glittering surface. It looked peaceful, like everything terrible had been buried neatly beneath it. But the men knew better. They always do. Miller woke to the crackle of the truck's frozen canvas and the low murmur of tank crews already stirring. Engines coughed, tracks shifted, boots scuffed against frost. The smell of yesterday fuel, smoke, blood still hung in the air. The lieutenant appeared, rubbing his gloved hands together. Command finally noticed us, he said. What'd they say? That we're still here. Miller nodded. Good of them to check. The 2 men shared a thin laugh, the kind that runs out before it becomes real. They were ordered to pull back and rejoin the main column before nightfall. But there was no column anymore, just fragments. Convoys scattered, supply lines snapped, orders arriving like snowflakes, too many, too late, too identical to matter. The ridge had been a wound in the line, hastily stitched shut by the thread of Miller's mistake. Now they were told to unravel it, to retreat so the war could proceed according to plan. Back the way we came, the lieutenant asked. Miller squinted at the road that had brought them here, the narrow corridor of pines, the blind curves where everything had gone wrong and right at once. It's not the same road, he said quietly. It never is after you've used it. The lieutenant didn't argue. He just nodded. Because soldiers know every road changes after it's paid for in fear. They started moving at noon. The tanks led, slow and cautious, their engines humming like tired hearts. Miller's truck followed, lighter now, emptier, quieter. Its drums rattled softly in the back, hollow like bells that had forgotten what sound was for. The forest closed around them again, a green-black tunnel heavy with snow. Sunlight came in thin slashes through the branches, cutting the air into cold gold. Every sound carried for miles, a twig snapping, a gear grinding, a breath. The men said nothing. They didn't need to. The war was speaking for them in its constant whisper. Keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. Halfway down the slope, they passed the burned hulks of two panthers. Their armor still steamed faintly where the fire had eaten through. Miller looked at them and thought how quickly steel forgets its purpose once it stops moving. It was strange how something built to be invincible could look so human when broken. By mid-afternoon, they reached a junction marked by a half-melted signpost. It pointed in 4 directions, each name half buried under snow. The lieutenant unfolded a map, studied it as if belief could make it true. Which way? He asked. Miller stared at the choices, none of them familiar, all of them roads to somewhere that didn't exist anymore. He looked at the tracks on the ground, the faint imprints left by the convoy he'd lost days ago. Then he pointed to the one road without marks, a narrow, crooked trail leading into the forest's deeper shadow. Not that way, said the lieutenant. That way, Miller replied. How do you know? I don't, he said. But that's the only kind that works. For a moment, the lieutenant just stared at him, then folded the map, slipped it back into his coat, and waved the column forward. The road obeyed no doctrine. It wound, it narrowed, it disappeared, then returned, like a memory trying not to be forgotten. They stopped by a stream at dusk. The tanks idled one by one into silence, the sound fading like a heartbeat slowing after a sprint. Men dismounted and began the ritual of waiting, eating, smoking, repairing, pretending the war had boundaries. Miller climbed into the back of his truck, unscrewed the caps of the remaining drums. They were empty, but he checked anyway. A driver's habit, trust nothing but the evidence of your own hands. The smell lingered, faint, sweet, ghost-like. He wiped his palms on his coat and stared at them. Fuel had soaked into the fabric, into his skin. He would smell of it for weeks, maybe forever. The lieutenant joined him, holding 2 cups of something that wanted to be coffee. Fuel's out, Miller said. The lieutenant nodded. Yeah, but the line's alive. That's more than yesterday. They stood there, side by side, listening to the forest breathe. Somewhere far off, artillery rumbled, a reminder that peace was still just an idea. Later, when night came again, Miller sat alone in the cab. The stars were out. Cold, small, countless. He thought about the wrong road, about how it had felt when the tires first slipped, when the world tilted, and the compass spun. He had cursed it then. Now he wasn't so sure. It was strange. The things that save you never look like salvation while they're happening. They look like failure, like confusion, like turning the wrong way when everyone else keeps straight. He realized that progress, the kind that builds machines or wins battles or changes men, doesn't begin with knowing where you're going. It begins with refusing to stop when you don't. And in that realization, something inside him went quiet. Not peace, not comfort, just understanding. The kind that hums like an engine idling, waiting for the next turn. When morning came, the light was thin and apologetic, the kind of light that promises nothing except that the world still exists. Frost blazed the hoods of tanks, helmets, and the steel ribs of Miller's truck. Smoke curled upward in lazy ribbons from ration fires, each one marking the small, stubborn fact of survival. The lieutenant was already awake, reading new orders that had arrived overnight. They were printed, stamped, and official, the kind of words that always arrived late enough to describe the past, not the present. He folded them carefully, as if the gesture itself mattered more than the contents. "Command wants us to regroup at the river crossing," he said, not looking up. Miller was checking tire pressure, though he knew the air was frozen solid in the tubes. "Where's that?" "About 20 miles east." Miller smirked. "On what road?" The lieutenant shrugged. "Whichever one still believes in us." They laughed quietly, because laughter was cheaper than hope. The convoy moved again, slow, deliberate, aware of its own fragility. Treads creaked. Engines murmured like prayers half remembered. The snow was thinner now, the roads slick with meltwater and ash. Along the way they passed what had once been a village. The roofs were gone. Only chimneys stood, like fingers pointing towards something that never answered. An old well sat in the center, rimmed with ice. Miller stopped the truck and peered down. Blackwater stared back. He thought about fuel, how it looked the same, dark, bottomless, necessary. The lieutenant climbed down from the lead tank. "We're off the map again," he said simply. "Good," Miller replied. "Good. Paper roads only tell you where others already died." They crossed a bridge that should have collapsed, but hadn't. The wood moaned under their weight, each plank testing its faith in the living. Below, a river whispered under ice, still moving, even in captivity. Miller listened. Rivers and roads speak the same language, motion without destination. It was comforting, in a way, to realize he'd become fluent. On the far bank, the lieutenant gestured for a halt. He pointed to a distant hill where a new supply column was snaking forward. Lines of trucks, jeeps, and half-tracks crawling like insects across a page. "Looks like the real road found us," he said. Miller shook his head. "No," he said. "We found them." The lieutenant smiled, not proudly, but as if he'd just heard the world's oldest truth repeated by accident. That evening, when the sky bruised into dusk, they reached the crossing. Uniformed officers waited there, clean, dry, unhurried. The kind of men who still believed war obeyed paperwork. Miller parked the truck beside a depot tent. Before he could climb down, 2 supply clerks were already inspecting it. They scribbled notes, counted drums, frowned at empty seals. "Where's the rest of your load?" one asked. "Gone," Miller said. "Gone where?" He gestured west toward the ridge that still smoldered faintly in the distance. "Home," he said. The clerk scowled, unimpressed by poetry. He marked something on a clipboard. "Unauthorized distribution," he muttered. Miller nodded. "That sounds about right." The lieutenant stepped forward, his uniform torn and blackened. "His cargo saved my men," he said flatly. The clerk looked up, pencil frozen midair. "That's not in the report." "Then the report's wrong." There was a long pause, a brief, bureaucratic silence that smelled faintly of fear. Then the clerk shrugged. "Fine," he said, and moved on. It was victory in the smallest, truest form. The next day, Miller's truck was refitted, refueled, reloaded. War had no time for sentiment. Every driver was replaceable, every road temporary. He was assigned a new route, east this time, toward another front that someone else was already losing. Before he left, the lieutenant found him. He handed him a small metal flask, dented and cold. Inside, a thin layer of whiskey shimmered like captured sunlight. "You earned it," the officer said. Miller unscrewed the cap, inhaled, then closed it again. "Smells like gasoline," he said. The lieutenant grinned. "All good things do." They shook hands, not the crisp shake of ceremony, but the clumsy one of men who had run out of words. Then Miller climbed into the cab, shifted gears, and rolled away. The sound of the engine faded into the endless hum of all the other engines of war. The ridge, the fight, the wrong road, they slipped into the rear view like ghosts that never stopped walking. Weeks later, the battle was officially declared a turning point. Reports credited logistics, air superiority, and the resilience of American armor. Names were printed. Maps were redrawn. Everything fit neatly into the narrative of reason. No one mentioned the driver who took the wrong road. No one mentioned the convoy that never was, the crossroads that shouldn't have existed, or the fuel that came from nowhere. But somewhere, in a letter that never left a pocket, a lieutenant wrote down one sentence. "A man drove through snow and found us. That's all that mattered." The letter was never sent. It didn't need to be. The story had already begun to move on its own, like rumor, like wind, like a convoy, without orders. Years later, when Miller was back home, the world had turned quiet again. He drove civilian trucks, now bread, timber, concrete, cargo that didn't bleed. He took the same care with them as he had with fuel. Old habits survived peace the way old scars do, invisible but tender when touched. Sometimes on winter mornings he'd slow at a crossroads without knowing why. He'd look left a little longer than necessary. Then he'd drive on, because that's what roads teach you, not where to go, but how to keep going. The smell of gasoline never left his hands. It followed him through years, through miles, through silences too long for stories. And when people asked what he'd done in the war, he would always say the same thing: I drove. That was all. That was enough. History has a way of hiding its miracles inside mistakes. A scientist spills the wrong chemical. A builder misreads a blueprint. A soldier takes the wrong road. And the world changes, not by design, but by deviation. The Battle of the Bulge was turned by weather, by leadership, by timing. But between those grand forces, somewhere in the snow, a single man proved a quieter truth, that progress, like survival, rarely follows instructions. It takes the shape of a wrong road that refuses to end, a truck that doesn't stop, a driver who forgets fear long enough to deliver motion where it had died. That's what keeps the machine alive. Not strategy, not perfection, just men who keep driving through the blizzard until they find something worth saving. They said roads decide wars. They were right, but it was never the roads we planned. It was the ones we found, and sometimes the future doesn't come from the right direction. It comes roaring from the wrong road, full of fuel and stubbornness, just in time to change everything.